I guess the broader topic is the way that the Western influence on Thai Muay Thai over the decades, and in particular right now, there's a very strong influence to make Thai more aggression-oriented. That in Muay Thai, there's a general, in a traditional Muay Thai, there's a general aesthetic that rewards controlling yourself, not losing control. And this goes right with what we were talking about with Sanchai, the out-of-control, brawly, anger-fueled male fighter that we love in the fucking West, the beast mode. Beast mode, traditionally in Thailand, unless you knock them out, demerits. You cannot, it is not what Muay Thai is. Muay Thai is about control of yourself and control over your opponent.
What we're talking about now is that I was having a discussion with my therapist, who also has done martial arts in her experience. And I was talking about this kind of difficulty as a Western woman coming into a culture that's not mine. It's a male-dominated sport, being a woman. Like, there are many things that make this unbelievably difficult in a lot of ways at a lot of times. And she made a point about how she had witnessed in her discipline, which is not Muay Thai, that men had this, I don't know, weak point, or it was crazy for her to watch when these men would spar, and she's in Italy, so this is Italian masculinity. It's like when you roid rage, or like you go into beast mode or something, and they would just get carried away with themselves and just kind of like snowball out of control.
Escalation.
It escalates, and she's like, you just watch it and you're like, they can't help themselves, this is crazy. And I thought this was an amazing point, because she can't know this, she doesn't know Muay Thai, but I was like, this is interesting, because for my discipline, in traditional Muay Thai scoring, where there's this kind of like, Kevin wrote a really beautiful thing about the monk and the Nak Muay, where there's this kind of like masculinity that ties together of, you would not think a monk and a Muay Thai fighter have anything being taught in common, but this kind of Ning, not escalating, not being rageful, just kind of being very unbothered, unmoved. This is traditional Muay Thai scoring. And so I was like, this is very interesting, because for traditional Muay Thai scoring, what she's saying, women actually have an advantage towards that scoring of not raging out, not being beast mode, not getting carried away with testosterone driven, like, fuck you, bro, Sanchai's opponents kind of thing.
And we should say that this disparity has led, probably for decades, Westerners feel like Thais are not being very fair to them.
Right.
Because Westerners come with beast mode.
Right.
And
they're like, dude, I got so mad. Why did I not win that fight?
I was marching forward and throwing more strikes and whatever.
I shouted louder.
Yeah, but I'm saying in Thai culture, you're actually showing that you have no control over yourself.
Right.
And unless you're knocking someone out, you're looking like you're a crazy person yelling in the alley.
Right.
Like,
which is interesting now, because there's a shift, not in traditional Muay Thai shows, but in this kind of influence of what they call international shows in Thailand.
Entertainment Muay Thai, as they call them.
Entertainment Muay Thai. It is not in traditional Muay Thai set rules, but it's becoming popular, which is this kind of like short 3 rounds, just go forward. Like, we've talked about this in other Muay Thai Bones, but there's still this slight bridge where like you can go forward, brawly, whatever, but you're not supposed to be mad, I guess. But it doesn't seem to matter that much.
I think you could be mad. Like, so that you guys are following, there's these new promotions that actually are expressing Western, or in part non-Thai values.
And aesthetic. Yep.
And aesthetics. Japanese anime type ragey, angry warrior also ties into this also. Like, you get the grimace of Bukao, who fought and was a star in Japan, this like grimacing. Now you, even in stadium fighters, you have Thais getting up on the corner and screaming on the ropes afterward. These are things that wouldn't have been done 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
It's like dignity and civilized thing about it that these other
Well, that's one of the
performances
most
don't.
beautiful things about Muay Thai, at least to me, is that it has a very strong thread of self-control and controlling your opponent, but at the same time, it is quite violent. But the violence is not an emotional violence. It is a kind of like will to dominance kind of thing. But you do not get there by emotionally dominating your opponent. Sanchai is not going to, going back to our last segment, he's not going to aggro out his opponent.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that we've loved about Muay Thai for a really long time, which is that you give someone else the opportunity to expose what they are.
Their own weakness, yeah.
You're like, we'll just turn this up until you show what you really are.
Yeah, we've said this, that the ultimate goal of Muay Thai is to have your opponent crumble under their own weight. And you just help them along, you just kick out the leg of the table and it falls. But you don't ultimately want to be like, I'm the one who did that to you, remember my name. One of the biggest reform that Muay Thai has ever undergone was actually in the name of civilizing its national sport. And that's where you get the adoption of all of Western boxing rules. You have the gloves, you have the timed rounds, you have the points, you have the padded corners, the rings that used to be a circle, basically, and rounds. The whole thing became an imitation of civilized Western boxing, which Western boxing had also gone through a period of civilization previous to that with the Queensberry rules. It used to be bare knuckle. It too had become civilized within its own, in its own story. What's interesting is the Muay Boran uncivilized nature was probably not, we don't know, aggro fighting. It was not people angry at each other trying to club each other to death. It was the fact that legs were used, the fact that fists were bound but not with gloves, and fights often ended in a knockout.
Yeah.
From what I've read. And so this is the very interesting thing. Thailand, in order to find acceptance in the eyes of the West, civilized its martial art, its fighting art,
in order to fit
in with the West. And now the West is like,
aggro,
you're not
aggro.
aggressive enough for us. So you're too violent, too aggressive. We might take over your country. I don't know, how long has it been now? It was around 1920 that this...
Like 100 years.
So it was about 100 years ago. 100 years later, it's like, Thais are not aggro enough, aggressive enough. And so Muay Thai is now bending back to the needs of the Western eye. To open this up to a larger concept, which we're not going to explore here, but for you to think about it, if anybody loves to think about colonialism and the control of cultures from afar and how much one respects another culture, Muay Thai as we know it was already a really big acquiescence to the West.
Yeah.
Which is, we're going to become civilized by putting pillows on our hands. Like, that's what
If you ever wonder why punching doesn't score super high in Muay Thai, it's the only part of your body that's padded.
That's padded.
And you can hit with parts that aren't.
Yeah. So you can hit somebody with a shin or a knee or an elbow, bone on bone,
Right.
but you're like, I'm hitting you with pillows.
Right.
Granted, the gloves were very tiny back then.
They're like oven mitts. They're very small.
But the Muay Thai that we've come to call traditional was already a submission to Western imposition of values that was like, be civilized. Then it incorporated them, and now it's getting this other message from the West, which is like, if you want to survive economically, be angry. And there's this weird thing, which is this aggro beast mode mentality cuts against some very deep Thai cultural values, which are Buddhistic values, which is like, how do you deal with your emotions? What emotions do you show?
What is masculinity?
What
That's
is
like kind of like stoic.
This kind of like, yeah, this kind of stoic, self-contained, I do not lose control over myself. All of that is woven into this Western, which is a kind of colonialism. It's not just Western, it actually comes from the East too. It's a global attitude towards emotions now. But it's exerting this colonialist kind of pressure on this martial art, on this fighting sport.